Good evening, sir. Good evening to all who've gathered here.
Good evening. So first of all, good morning to Kirbhagaran. Good evening to everybody. First of all, I like to welcome our past chairman Selvaraj sir.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you.
Kumar sir, Samidas sir, and Balakrishnan committee member, and Professor TKR from NIT Trichy. The past chairman Dr. Dharmalingam sir, and Rajamani sir from IE TNSC, chairman TNSC. I welcome you all for the guest lecture on applications of AI in oil sands by Dr. Kirbhagaran. So Dr. Kirbhagaran was a very interesting personality, especially in the area of artificial intelligence and reinforcement learning. On behalf of IATLC and on behalf of CSI Tiruchirappalli chapter, we are jointly organizing this particular workshop. So we are delighted to have him. I welcome you all once again. Right now, I request Selvaraj sir to formally introduce the speaker, and subsequently he will deliver a talk for 45 minutes. And whomsoever is interested to ask question can post the question, and immediately after the lecture, questions will be clarified. With that, we'll have a vote of thanks, formal vote of thanks. Thank you, sir. So now I request Selvaraj sir to introduce Kirbhagaran.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Happy good evening to all of you. Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Dr. Kirbhagaran, very good evening to all. Good morning to all you, and good evening to all our past chairman and all the invitees member, Rajamani sir, or Ramdas sir, everybody, Samidas sir, everybody. So I'll start the introduction of the speaker. Before starting the Kirbhagaran slide quote, I wanted to just tell, then we'll start something. No one else can give you the answers to the challenges of the future. It will be up to you to find those answers, the answers that will rebuild ourselves. That is a quote liked by our today's guest, Dr. Kirbhagaran. So with this, I'll start the introduction of our chief guest today. That is, he is a postdoctoral fellow. That is from University of Alberta, Canada. From October 2016, there are personally about 3 years and 9 months experienced. Then he was a lead engineer in Lennox International from April 2015 to September 2016. There were about 1 year and 6 months in Chennai. And he was a research scholar at National Institute of Technology, Trichy, from February 2012 to March 2015, about 3 years and 2 months. And he was a senior software engineer in the Lennox International from March 2010 to February 2012, about 2 years. And he was an embedded software engineer trained India Design Center from June 2008 to March 2010. There are about 1 year and 10 months. He worked in communication stack design development for motor control software. And in Delphi as a software engineer, he worked from July 2006 to May 2008, about 1 year, 11 months. And he did his MTech from NIT in 2004 to 2006. There is MTech in process control instrumentation. And from Bharat University, that is, he did B electronics and instrumentation from 2000 to 2004. So with this, I'll conclude my introduction. I over to Dr. Kirbhagaran, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
A very good morning or a good evening to the elite gathering. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I'd like to begin by thanking my mentor and godfather, Dr. T.K. Radhakrishnan, without whom I'll be nowhere. And equally important in my life is Dr. N. Sivakumaran for the kind of opportunities they have brought about in my life when it was necessary. Thank you so much for having been the platform from which I have kind of reached where I am. And just to begin with, the discussion today is about artificial intelligence, and it's about applications in oil sands. A brief introduction about oil sands. Oil sands are at times called tar sands. are actually a source of crude oil, which is like probably the second biggest reserve in the world of crude oil. However, there is a lot of refining that has to happen before it can be used like regular crude. So it's one of the biggest reserves that Canada has. And Alberta as a province has a lot of reserves with respect to the oil sands. So it becomes a field of importance where there's a lot of research carried out in this province, in this part of the world. So being a part of a very talented team led by our professor, Dr. Bia Huang, we've been working on multitude of applications for oil sands, including research. And this is one of those streams from which I'm going to share a few of our findings, and hopefully it helps the people. So the outline for the discussion today is going to be a touch upon what's autonomous systems, why do we need to move towards that, and we're going to just talk about how it's being implemented already in real time, and also how can it be incorporated in process industries. A little brief discussion on the differences as such with respect to the multitude of solutions we have around machine learning, and a brief introduction on reinforcement learning, and a very important component of open pit excavation and further processing of oil sands in Alberta is primary separation vessel, and that's the actual system on which we've tried to implement an application of reinforcement learning. So I'll briefly touch upon that too. Given the current duration of this presentation, I'll try to be brief, and please do raise your hand, and please do ask your questions on the way through, and I'll be happy to answer them. So autonomous systems. So decision making is an important part of being a human, and not just mapping between certain inputs that we see and also certain decisions that we take based on the inputs. The way we train ourselves, and then the way we tackle our situations, all that comes under the purview of autonomous systems. So in eventuality, if there is a certain event that was not anticipated in the past, so what would be the actual response that you would get from the agent or the process that, or the controller that you have trained? So that's usually the autonomous part of the decision making. So there are systems that do exist. So if you look at the missile defense systems, which form a blanket over probably like a confined space or maybe like the entire country. So given there is a launch of like a intercontinental ballistic missile or things of sorts. So an autonomous system kicks in, it knows the launch, and then it triggers certain events which are going to make sure that it pinpoints the trajectory of the incoming missile, and it tries to destroy it before it can create havoc in the country. So this is something that does exist. We've also seen autopilots that are in existence in the aeroplanes, but at a very high sophisticated level, right, from a few decades in the past. So this is not something new. When it comes to standardization of different levels of autonomy, there are a multitude of approaches that are seen in my various industries. The one that has come out with a clear demarcation of each level of autonomy is the automotive industry. With the advent of companies like Tesla, which are promoting autonomous driving, this becomes important because the progress of each of those organizations in such eventual technology needs to be graded, and metrics need to indicate what sort of capabilities their vehicles hold. At the lowest level, we are talking about no autonomy at all. So it's a basic vehicle which does not have any electronic control units, which kind of like talk to each other or log some data which could be processed later. So it's like the ones from the 80s or the 90s. Then comes the first level of autonomy where you have operational assistance. For instance, you have cruise control where you're on the highway, you just want to take your feet off the pedal of the gas. So you switch to cruise control at a certain speed, and the vehicle tries to maintain that speed. However, the steering control is still in your hands. And one other scheme is the lane departure alert, where it could probably like alert the driver saying, hey, you're way off your lane and please correct yourselves. The next level is like occasional self-driving. You're on a highway and you know that things are all working fine and it's a clear day. And so you switch over to occasional self-driving. And so the vehicle may at some certain point not need you to steer the vehicle, but you would still hold your steering wheel because that would probably be necessary. And the next one is limited self-driving. And limited self-driving is where there may be more features available. For instance, you can program in a standard destination point for which you have probably driven before, and the vehicle could take you there. And in the event of any abnormal situations, it would allow you or prompt you to take over. And that's how limited self-driving is implemented. And full self-driving is, that is a driver, but not much is done by the driver. He's just behind the wheels trying to supervise the vehicle. And this is something of reality because in Phoenix, Arizona, they already have, Google already has its own fleet of taxis, which are working in a full self-driving mode. However, the number of sensors and the kind of fusion of all that information is pretty complex and is being dealt with. And it is not something that's available as an off-the-shelf product as of this point of time. And complete self-driving is where you might not even find a driver's seat or all the tools that are associated with the driver. So that's something in the making too. Now, is there something of that sort available for industrial plants? Though there's not a fine print on the demarcations and there's no general consensus on how we could look into these sort of standards for an industry, there does exist some amount of discussion that happens between in the organizations by their own. Probably at some point they would come together to discuss more about it and standardize it. At this point, a few publications have become available, and one of them is the way they describe autonomy in terms of industry is no autonomy, where we do not have any sort of autonomous systems. Of course, we have like automation, but not autonomy. The next one is operational assistance. This is primarily the digital twin as being discussed in the industry now. The idea is there is an experienced person, and that experienced person has certain decision-making intuitions, which is probably not something that you can map into a mathematical model because it's more human. So how do you capture the essence of their experience and make sure that in a certain scenario, you give some recommendations where there are certain priorities set to the kind of decisions you can take, which is based upon the previous experience of that operator. And this can very well be used in trying to absorb the experience a person has obtained by working in certain plant and making sure that the transition of that knowledge from that person to probably someone who is new takes place with the best possible smooth transition. Now, occasional control is probably the next level. For instance, if there is a startup or a shutdown, there is a necessity for us to follow a certain sequence, which is pretty mechanical in nature in the sense that the sequences are pretty direct. So you could probably yield control in those situations from a human being to an autonomous system, which can take care. And then comes limited control. Then again, it's a fine grain. And full control is where you're talking about one supervisor sitting in the control panel or the control room for the entire plant. And all he does is just be there to assess how the system's working, and he does not much. And full control is where you have complete autonomy, where there's no single person who's there in the factory, and the entire enterprise solution and the business requirements are kind of trickled down directly to the level of the PID controllers. And therefore, you could probably bring in financial direction of the company and also probably environmental compliance and all that, and trickle it down to the level 0 where there is a meaningful transition of information from one level to the other. Again, the difference between autonomy and automation. So what we do in automation is we sense. Of course, there are a bunch of sensors. We might probably also replace it with a data analytics or a first principles or some sort of a linear regression based soft sensor, and we analyze. Analysis is usually predetermined. So you have a bunch of rules, for instance, if else's, or it's an explicit sort of a scheme where we have a PID controller. So you're sensing something and you know that it has to be reaching a certain set point. So the deviation is used, and proportionately there is certain amount of action that's taken. So all these are predestined. They are not, if specially designed, if not specially designed, they are not capable of handling adverse situations. Whereas autonomy, on the other hand, does not sense but perceive. For instance, it can be an image. For instance, you are walking out on the park on a bright day, and you get to see a particular frame, maybe through a camera, and a bird in that frame would be a feature. So how do you know that there is a bird in the frame? So that is perception. So there is a necessity for us to extract a feature or many features out of that particular frame and make sense out of it. In a similar sense, if you look at it from an industrial context, you are looking at a multitude of sensors. And when you look at them separately, they may not make sense. However, when you combine them together, there are a lot of correlations between multitude of sensors, because process-wise, they have some connections. There is some causality relationship between, say, pressure and temperature and so on. And what we could eventually end up having is all that data or the information that's provided by maybe like a huge number of sensors could probably be compressed down to a few features because they have relationships between each other. So these few features could now represent the entire plant. And how do you make sense out of those features? That's what is the portion of the perception. And then you need to understand it. So understanding is where the human content comes in. So it's always possible that we have some mathematical models which are designed for the normal times. Of course, we have certain historical data from which we can derive some inferences on what's normal and what's not. So we can try to understand the features, and then there can be solutions that are provided. Let's say, for instance, think of something like a fault tolerance strategy. So you have to remap maybe a couple of valves to make sure that it complies with some safety norms, or maybe it tries to reroute the product or the flow of your product to make sure that it keeps going, though there is certain issue with maybe like the valve itself. So things of that sort. So how do you reconfigure your plant, or how do you come up with some solution given an adverse situation? That's solving. So this definitely provides a distinct change in the attitude of our approach towards control. Well, artificial intelligence is a loosely used term. Now, there are a lot of things that we do in artificial intelligence. The basic thing that has organically grown over the past is supervised learning. What we do in supervised learning is to label the data. What do we call as labels? For instance, let's take a simple example. So you have a set of photographs of horses and a set of photographs of elephants. Now you let the neural network, which is probably the platform on which we do, excuse me, most of these AI solutions, you let the neural network know that a specific set is horses and the next set belongs to, for instance, the elephants. So now the neural network tries to extract the information from the images, and it generalizes its decision making based upon the number of images that you provide for training. So if you provide a new image which does not have, which has a horse in it, which does not belong to the training set, now the network is supposed to identify that as a horse. And if it were an elephant, it would say it's an elephant. So this is basic classification. Now, if you look at the amount of data that's necessary to really train the network to do this sort of classification, you would require humongous amount of data to initially train the neural network. If you translate it into probably time, you're looking at a few years worth of industrial data, which you can use to come up with some amicable solution. Now, in terms of unsupervised learning, there's no labeling necessary. It tries to group your information from a heuristic sense. Intuitively, it kind of like draws lines in between the data sets. So you have different groups of data that come along. So it could also be used in a sense. Now, what's very close to control systems, what originated from control systems, is more like reinforcement learning. Reinforcement learning, on the other hand, involves decision making. So you're really not telling the reinforcement learning platform, which is again the same neural network, except that the way you train it is a little different, to actually take some decisions. So the context of reinforcement learning would be like, if you provide the image of a horse and the reinforcement learning agent says it's an elephant, you try to penalize the reinforcement learning agent. And if it's otherwise, where you're talking about providing a horse and it says that it's a horse, now instead of a penalty, you're providing a reward. It's very similar to how you would train a primate or so on. So this decision making allows us to generalize better. In the case of supervised learning, your final neural network is only as good as your training data. But in terms of reinforcement learning, it's generalizing much better. So it's the extent to which it understands those features that I was talking about. For instance, a horse which is there in that image. How do you know that it's a horse? What features describe a horse? So all that is something that RL allows the neural network to learn in a more intuitive heuristic sense. Now, what's deep reinforcement learning? Well, if you look at an image, the image is actually pixels. So you have a matrix based upon the size of the image. And if it's a grayscale, it's just a two-dimensional matrix. Whereas if it's a color image, it's going to be a three-dimensional matrix. So when you talk about deep reinforcement learning, within that matrix, when you're trying to process one pixel, you just don't consider that one pixel alone. You try to consider all the pixels around it, and then you come up with the feature extraction. So this way, in that space, the spatial portion is kind of convoluted. And so you get multitude of features, even moments. For instance, you can look at the velocity in the profile. You can look at the acceleration in that profile with respect to each of the pixels. So it allows you to look into a multitude of information, which otherwise is not really seen by a normal eye. So reinforcement learning, the brief introduction here is that we have been able to train a multitude of animals and birds because of the one almond-sized, I should say, organ, which is like the amygdala that's there. So on mostly all levels of living beings. So apart from single-cell creatures. So what that does is it holds in it the scheme to respond to, or react, I should say, because it's pretty instantaneous, to situations around us. So the way it's mapped is amygdala actually releases dopamine, which is the feel-good hormone. And when you train your animals with some sort of a reward at any given point where they do what we want, so that's positive reinforcement. You're really not punishing them for not doing something, but you're rewarding them when they do what you want. So the dopamine gets released. And at some point, you take off that reward, and the signal to do certain tasks is given, and the brain or the amygdala maps it to a reward, and it immediately reacts, and so the animals respond. So this is very similar to what we would probably like do to train anyone. Now, moving on to a brief introduction on reinforcement learning's components. So there is an agent and an environment. So the agent is, in this case, a dog, which is thinking. And the environment constitutes of where the dog works and the dynamics coming out of it. For instance, a trainer who is training the dog. So what they eventually do is when the trainer instructs the agent to do something or the dog to do something like a sit, charge, roll, etc., if they do it properly, they're going to receive a reward. And this is the entire construct of reinforcement learning. So you have an agent and an environment. From an industrial control hierarchy, there are like a few places where we can employ reinforcement learning with respect to trying to learn what a person has gained as an experience. So these are such situations. When we are trying to explore reinforcement learning, one thing that comes into the picture is how do we make sure that it is generalized to take care of every other situation. For instance, you've been trying to use the transit or the buses which ply locally in say Trichy, and then now you are asked to kind of like do the same in Chennai. There are kind of like multitude of information that is necessary for you to ramp up on your usage of the transits in Chennai, whereas you had enough knowledge to use it in Trichy. So this is because of the new sort of experience that the agent is being put through. In a similar sense, when you operate your plant at a certain operating region, and that's where you have all the data, and that's where you have trained your reinforcement learning agent, all of a sudden your plant moves from one region to the other. How does your RL agent understand the new region of operation, and how does it do things to make sure that the plant still runs in an optimal fashion, at the same time ensuring stability? So the stability of the process during the learning scenario for the RL agent is a pretty important bottleneck to deal with. When you're talking about neural networks to represent the reinforcement learning agent, the neural network in itself has its parameters that you need to tune. Like in a PID controller, you have a K, KP, KI, and KD. In terms of neural networks, it just explodes. You're talking about a few thousands of parameters that needs to be tuned. So when you do not see it initially, the neural network in a proper sense, it might take a lot of time for it to really understand the process and to start controlling it. So it's important for us to capitalize on existing knowledge. One of the ways in which we could do it is probably look back into the historical data that's available and see how we can use that. Now, from a low-level control setup, I know that it is a sensitive topic to deal with. Practitioners do not like replacing proportional integral derivative controllers, and it is not our intent to replace the PID controllers with the reinforcement learning agent. However, if you look at the entire industrial complex at different levels of hierarchy, this is the place where we have the most complex decision-making scenario, because it is time-bound. So it's hard time the system where you need to make a decision probably like based upon the sampling time of that particular loop. So the decision-making or the optimization has to be fast and also accurate. So if we could probably see how the RL agent works here and how we can fit it here, that is probably going to be the toughest challenge to face. As we move up the control hierarchy, for instance, the next level where you're probably doing some real-time optimization, maybe you're using something like a Honeywell Profit Suite, where you're looking at the steady state map of the process, and then you're trying to find those operational points which can combine together to come up with the best economic perspective of that production, or the best compliance perspective of the production. So all that is probably something that's aided, but the kind of space you'll deal with in that level is much smaller compared to the kind of space meaning when you look at a measurement, the measurement is going to be like, for instance, pressure, it's going to be continuous. It's not going to be discrete. So you're looking at a huge amount of data that you will need to really train your network. So if it works here, it's going to work at high levels. So the way we see it is control is actually the agent. And we use a scheme called actor critic, where actor is the neural network which maps your measurements to your manipulations. For instance, it measures the pressure. Now it probably like controls some sort of a flow rate like that. And the critic is what tries to understand the action in a longer term sense. So what is the long-term impact of a certain action? That's what the critique looks into. So the critique is now measuring into the longer term returns. So the return is nothing but, for instance, if you take one sample time, you're going to have a measurement and a set point. So that deviation becomes a reward. And if you look at the reward for certain number of steps into the future and you combine them together, then you get the returns. So this is the rewarding that you have obtained for taking a certain action for a given measurement. So this would allow us to optimally take decisions, which is something similar to an MPC, but in an MPC you would use a model. Here you don't need a model. Okay. Okay, so there is some problem with the fonts here. I'm sorry about that. So let's assume that you have, say, 3 measurements that are coming in. So I'm representing the space that's covered by the 3 of the measurements in this form of the sphere. And what we're doing in turn is, for instance, if you want to take, say, actions, now those actions are again a space. So you have, for instance, a multi-input, multi-output process where you have 3 manipulations and 3 measurements. Now you're looking at this output space as another sphere. Now, all we're doing is the neural network tries to see if you have a certain point in that space in the input, what's the best point in the output space which can optimize our some objective. That objective can be economic, that objective can be performance oriented, or it can again be compliance oriented. And it goes on to learn the best possible mapping at any given instance. And this is exactly what we are trying to do the neural network using reinforcement learning. A primary separation vessel as such constitutes of an open pit mined tar sands that brought in, crushed, and it's mixed with hot water and some chemicals, and it's kind of fed into a PSV, which is constituting of 3 different layers. So you have the middlings layer where the froth, as we call it, is released. So it constitutes of like bitumen, from which we recover synthetic crude, and also some solids and also water. So the bitumen as such is lighter, so it moves to the top, and the solids as such settle to the bottom. So the idea here is there is an interface that's formed between the middlings and the top layer, which is called the froth layer. So the important parameter to control here is this interface. So whenever the interface goes lower, the froth escapes through your tailings to what's called the tailings ponds, where we send the solids as well as hot water, and the solids settle down in the ponds and the hot water is extracted to be used again. Whereas if it's going to go higher, there is a possibility that the sand that's there can actually go through the top for further downstream production, which would definitely be detrimental to even the devices and their working. So it's necessary for us to maintain it in a certain level. So that's what we are trying to do here. We used industry evaluated complex model to come up with the solution. So what we've done here is we wanted to track the set point of that interface level, and we utilized a scheme where we went for imitation learning. If you have come across the news on Tesla, Tesla actually utilizes real driver responses, and the real driver responses are mapped between the sensors that are there in the car and the kind of decision making that the driver has on that scenario. They first filter out the best driving scenarios, the driver's best responses, and then they try to collate that into information that they'll use to tune some neural networks. So this is called imitation learning. It's something similar to that we do here, but it's not something that we have followed from Tesla. So it was like 2 branched out things that we were able to look into at probably the same time instance. So we have an expert and a rookie. Rookie is someone who's new. And what we do is we represent the existing controller, maybe a PID, down here with also we have the agent, which is our reinforcement learning scheme. So we kind of try to use some sort of a selection mechanism. So the selection mechanism is there to ensure that the process is safe. So if the agent is way off from what the existing controller recommends for a given scenario, we ignore the agent and we simply use the existing controller's output. So the manipulations are guessed. And again, this is the actor critic format. So we have a couple of phases of training. In the first phase, we try to make our controller come closer to, or the agent come closer to the existing strategy. And in the second phase, what we do is we try to make our agent perform better by sending the right manipulations to the process. And this is just an example of how the whole thing works. So we are trying to track the interface level here. So you see that we are giving some set point changes. Also, certain disturbances, for instance, in terms of the inflow quality is varied, like how the industry would experience. And that's where you see a lot of oscillations there, some overshoots. Now, the one on the right side, the graph actually compares the existing strategy with the reinforcement learning strategy. So in the first phase, in the very beginning, we do see that there is a lot of differences between the decision that the conventional controller takes as compared to the reinforcement learning agent. Whereas if we train it further, after a certain amount of time, the RL agent has kind of confined itself to a point which is pretty closer to that of the conventional agent. It's still a little off. Now, the final result is where you have already completed phase 2. So what that means is that you initially trained your RL agent to be closer to the controller, and then you made it perform better. So we see that the blue dots are tracking, which is the RL agent, are tracking the set points pretty well. So this is an indication that the RL agent has not only learned an existing controller, but it has also bettered it, all without compromising on the stability that would be there on the process. So this is just a composite comparison. So what you see on the left side is the servo tracking results. What you see on the right side is the comparison between the existing strategy and the reinforcement learning agent's set of actions. As you see, over a period of time, the RL agent has tried to learn the controller and also tried to better it. This way, we are trying to solve the initial seed problem of the neural network. And this would definitely improve the rate at which we are able to learn our neural network as a reinforcement learning agent. Well, there are certain remarks that we have gotten from this particular scenario. One thing is that reinforcement learning can really take up a multitude of tasks with respect to the control hierarchy. For instance, we have just showcased what it can do at the lowermost level, replacing a PID controller. We do have research that's ongoing, which is because of the non-disclosure schemes. I would probably not be able to share, but you could probably look at RL agent as tuning schemes, maybe at the lowest level, like the controller itself, or it could probably tune a PID controller, or it could also look into a real-time optimization scheme because it does not need a model. So the amount of time that you will need to design it would be reduced greatly. So RL is able to be a very important tool with respect to autonomous control at various levels of control hierarchy. Currently, the issue is with respect to sampling efficiency, because if you have, say, 1,000 samples of data and you have 1,000 parameters to tune, you are overfitting it. Now, if you have 1,000 samples of data and you are able to tune those 1,000 parameters in the most effective way, that would be sample efficiency. So if you're in need of, say, 1 million data points to tune these 1,000 sample points, that is definitely going to be a complex scenario because you might not have all that data. So these are probably the pros and cons with respect to reinforcement learning. The one other issue that you would face is in the legacy systems, it's going to be pretty challenging to come up with libraries which could allow a control engineer to go and just drag and drop an RL block and ask it to train itself. So I think that's it. I I kind of like prepared for like a 35 minute presentation. And yeah, I think that's about it. Again, thank you very much for the opportunity. I can take questions now.
Yeah. I have two questions, Dr. Kribakaran.
Yes, sir.
One is that like you were explaining on the training, like you said, the initial part of the training, then you said 1,500 episodes. Then you went on to show that the last episode, right? Like, what is the difference between that last episode and the 1,500? Like, in terms of, you said it takes years of data to train.
Right. So when you look at it from an industrial perspective, the time at which you take decision is during every sample time. So for instance, the kind of experiment that we carried was episodic in nature. So between each episodes, we try to update the neural network based upon the optimization cost we obtain. So if we assume that one episode is of say 100 hours,
okay,
and that would mean it's kind of like close to a few days. This is like say 1,500 episodes. It's like you're looking at many number of hours of training or data that's necessary. So that is where I meant that it needs like years of data.
okay.
Now, if it's a simulation model, it doesn't matter. So if there is a possible representation of your plant dynamics in the form of an accurate model, it is much easier for us to initially seed this reinforcement learning agent. And therefore, what I spoke of as years of training would probably shrink, and you might have your reinforcement learning agent in a week of training. And from that point on, you can kind of like make it run in parallel in the plant and just check how the existing controller is taking actions and try to have a perspective of it from the RL agent, and that can reduce the amount of time.
And anyway, you have completed the experiments. Like, what is the economic benefits that you has that been evaluated?
So the benefits are basically a part of the design process. So we are looking at it from an optimization perspective, where the optimization can have a wide spectrum of usage. So you can look at pure economics or pure performance or find a middle ground. So based upon your choice of such selection, I guess that is something that you could look into.
No, like I'm just looking at it from the perspective of total quality of the product that you deliver.
Yes, so that is something that can be done. So from the current lower loop level, we were only looking at basic matrices like variance in control, and also the extent to which we're able to minimize the deviation from set point. So from that perspective, performance did well. But at a higher level, we also tried looking into something like recovery rate of bitumen, so which is more like an inferred parameter. So in that scenario, the reinforcement learning agent was supposed to manipulate the interface level of that primary separation vessel and make sure that we got the most bitumen out of it. So in that scenario, our objective was to improve extraction. So depending upon your objective, the RL agent can learn in that direction, because
that's what like I'm precisely asking that, because like once you are going to like leave bitumen in the sands, like you are going to also damage the environment. Right.
So from a process perspective, from an extraction perspective, with respect to the environmental impact, the agent could probably prevent bitumen from escaping through the tailings to the pond, which is considered to be an environmental issue. So we can have some hard constraints when the reinforcement learning agent is learning the scenario to at all costs prevent this scenario from happening, where the bitumen is escaping through the tailings to the pond. So in that instance, we can also incorporate through those hard constraints the economic compliances that are necessary, the environmental compliances that the RL agent has to take care of.
Thank you, Dr. Kribakaran.
Thank you, sir.
Can I have my question?
Sure, sir.
You were talking about reinforcement learning.
Right.
Is there a possibility that too much of reinforcement will lead to overload of data and thereby diminish the result?
You are absolutely right. That's a good question. So when we are talking about any sort of neural network training, the network is only as good as its data. And the extent to which we bring about generalization is by looking at different sets of data. And that would make sure that we are not using only certain experiences to come up with your answer or the tuning of your neural network. The way we tackle that is through something called asynchronous learning, where, for instance, in a lower loop, you might look at a nonlinear process which has different operating points, and the process may be working with at different levels, which would produce different dynamics. So in asynchronous learning, we have parallel computing, where we allow the reinforcement learning agent to work at different regions of operation. And we would learn from all those regions of operation at the same time. So this means we are generalizing the solution instead of specifying the solution, which was the case in supervised learning. So that way, there is a better generalization that's available in RL. However, as you said, it only depends upon the amount of, it's only as good as the data. So if you are able to provide enough data, RL will probably mature over time, better than the supervised learning scheme.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So any questions?
Dr. Kirubagaran?
Yes, sir.
Dr. Kirubagaran, I have a question.
Yeah.
Who are the leaders in autonomous vehicle now? The research, R&D level? Leaders in the world?
So I mean, I'm a big fan of Tesla. So they have their own graphics processing unit. So they have a very good way of fusion of all their sensors. So they have like radar, lidar, and actual, like charge coupled devices. They combine all that together and they come up with the best possible schemes at this point. But I should say probably like there are a lot many researches that are happening right now. So I do have a question from Mr. D. Sundar, and that's like, I think you use supervisory training. In this case, why not the experience of operation data can be included in this type of operation? You are very correct, sir. So the question is that why not use the operational data? Definitely, but we are not doing supervised training because though we use the data to come up with trying to get a model with which the RL agent can interact. So the agent's decisions has an impact on that model, and the agent is trying to learn what's that impact and try to improve it over a particular horizon that's of interest to you. So it's definitely not supervised training, but we do need the model to be created from it, the data sets.
Dr. Kirubagaran?
Yes, sir.
From the process point of view, which is more harmful, bitumen escaping through sand or sand escaping through bitumen?
Well, bitumen escaping through sand is much more harmful to the environment because to a certain extent, it can increase the toxicity in the environment. So from that perspective, definitely bitumen escaping through sands. Also from regulatory perspective, it would lead to a lot more like fines and environmental action taken by the government. So I guess that would be a bigger point of importance to us.
But sand escaping through bitumen is going to have some impact on the performance of the equipments.
That is for sure, right? And that is probably not of a higher priority as compared to people's lives. So this is of higher priority.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Any more questions? So I'd like to thank Kirubagaran for his wonderful lecture. The vote of thanks will be proposed by Samidas sir. So before that, the next week lecture would be on synergy-based human-machine interfaces by Dr. Ramana.
Kumaran. Kumaran.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So next
It's
week,
not clear.
sir. Next, can you able to hear me?
Next
Now it is okay. Please proceed.
not clear.
Okay. So next week we'll have lecture from Professor Ramana Kumar Venakamari. He is a professor in Harvey Davis Distinguished Professor in the Department of Biomedical Engineering, Steve's Institute of Technology, New York. So his area of research is on synergy-based human machine interfaces, for which his brief abstract would be on human machine interfaces have not only become popular technology but have become the more hope of many individuals on lost limb function. So any HMI has two important distinct components, which is decode the human commands and control the man to machine conversion, which decades of research went into making the interface between human and the machine seamless, but we were unable to effectively address the inherent challenges, namely complexity, adaptability, and variability. Hence, to overcome the overall challenges, it is critical to computationally understand, quantitative, characterize human sensory motor control. So, this topic would be on synergy-based human interface. Now, I request Mr. Ramdas sir, former chairman, to propose vote of thanks. Over to Ramdas sir.
Institution of Engineers, Trichy Local Center, to Mr. Kribakaran, who has taken his time to talk to all of us, educate us in all the aspects of oil sand. And I would like to thank the Galaxy of all past chairman, committee members, and our friends from Tamil Nadu State Center and Madurai Local Center. And finally, I would like to thank all those who have participated in today's lecture. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you once again.
Thank you all. Before closing, from the next week onwards, the lecture will start at 6 p.m. because this is the many